In today's video, we will talk about recording the recommendation on the sentencing guidelines. Guidelines users are always encouraged to use Swift because Swift will automatically populate recommendations for you. So how do you record your guidelines recommendations? Users can either use Swift, in which the information is automatically populated for you, or manually record the recommendations after manually completing the guidelines. Guidelines recommendations are populated onto the cover sheet from the totals on worksheets B or C in Swift. However, if there is a mandatory minimum required, users need to change recommendation to reflect the mandatory minimum. For more information on mandatory minimums, see mandatory minimum video. Guidelines users access Swift, they will need to enter in the court, select the appropriate worksheet, and enter in the defendant's name, last name, comma, first name. Most courts will allow Swift to automatically populate data from the particular court. And in this instance, users will then select their primary offense from the pending charges below. Once the user has selected the appropriate primary offense, they will then hit submit, and Swift will bring up the cover sheet for that defendant. You'll notice that most of the demographic information is populated for you, as well as the convictions. However, the sentencing guidelines recommendation section will be blank until users complete either sections B or C. And let's take a look at an example. We have sentencing event that contains discharging a firearm from a motor vehicle and shooting a missile at a train without malice. After completing section A, users will score out all factors, and in this instance will receive a score of 6. The instructions on section A ask users who receive a score of 8 or less to go to section B to obtain the recommendation. Once users access section B and complete this worksheet, total score for our example today will be 12, in which users will then refer back to the cover sheet, and you will find that the recommendation is 1 incarceration 1 day to 6 months, and it will be listed under section B, the sentencing guidelines recommendation on the cover sheet. Now let's take a look at the same sentencing event, but we're going to add weapon possession by violent felon. This offense has a mandatory minimum of 5 years, and once the guidelines are scored out, this total score will yield 17, in which recommendation is going to come from section C. Once guidelines users score out section C, will receive a total score of 32, and again refer back to the cover sheet for a recommendation of 1 year to 2 months, low end 2 years and 8 months at the midpoint, and 2 years and 10 months at the high end. But remember, with the mandatory minimum, users must change any portion of the recommendation to reflect that mandatory minimum. So check the box recommendation adjusted for mandatory minimum and enter in 5 years across the recommendation ranges. Now we will talk about how to record the recommendation manually using the PDFs. Guidelines users will access the PDFs, and similarly to the first sentencing event, score out section A and receive total score 6. Again, we're instructed to go to Section B, and after completing Section B, guidelines users will receive a total score of 13, in which users will refer to the recommendation table listed after Section B. And for a total score of 13, the recommendation is incarceration 1 day to 6 months. Users will then refer back to cover sheet and enter the corresponding recommendation under the section in which they completed. Now again, using the second example, adding possession of a weapon by a felon, users will score out the guidelines and receive a total score of 17. Refer to Section C. Users will complete Section C according to the rules and obtain a total score of 32. Guidelines users will then refer to the Section C recommendation table listed after the Section C worksheet. And for a total score of 32, the recommendation at the low end is 1 year and 2 months, 2 years and 8 months at the midpoint, and 2 years and 10 months at the high end. Guidelines users should then refer to the cover sheet and enter in the correct recommendation in the section. However, the mandatory minimum, users should make the adjustment, check the box for recommendation adjusted for mandatory minimum, and enter 5 years across the range. In summary, there are 2 methods for recording recommendation. Users may either use Swift, in which the recommendation will automatically be populated for you, or users can complete the guidelines manually, and if this is the preferred method, users must refer to the guidelines manual to obtain the appropriate recommendation range, enter the corresponding score on the cover sheet, and adjust any recommendation requiring a mandatory minimum by checking the box and entering in the appropriate recommendation. So recording recommendations. In recording recommendations, our guidelines recommendations automatically populated when completing sentencing guidelines manually. Which method automatically records sentencing guidelines recommendations? For the answer, text BCSD recommend to 56512. Thank you for tuning into this video, and as always, any questions, contact us on the hotline at 804-225-4398. Send us a text to 804-393-9588 or email any staff member at the Commission, and we'll be more than happy to assist you.